We are pleased to have Dr. Marshall here with us today. He has been heavily involved in wireless technology and policy for many years, including authoring numerous articles, books, and chapters on subject of cognitive radio spectrum issues. Prior to Google, he was the Deputy Director of the Information Sciences Institute, ISI, at the University of Southern California. And before that, he was Program Manager with DARPA. He currently is the chair of the Wireless Innovation Forum Spectrum Sharing Subcommittee, co-chair of the steering group developing the standards base for 3.5 gigahertz spectrum sharing, and the vice chair of the CBRS Alliance, developing coexistence and neutral host technology for the 3.5 gigahertz band. He also has a new book on this subject, 3-tier shared spectrum, shared infrastructure, and a path to 5G, to be released by Cambridge University Press shortly. Today's presentation will discuss the U.S. experience in deploying shared spectrum services in the 3.5 gigahertz Citizens Broadband Radio Service, CBRS band. This innovative band concept is potentially a fundamental change in how wireless is designed, managed, and deployed. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Preston Marshall.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So before TJ comes out and talks about what's happening right now, I want to talk a little bit about the future of spectrum. And the future of spectrum really defines the future of wireless. We name our technologies after the regulations and the policies that created them. Also, you'll note out there, it promised you a speaker from Google, and my slides say Alphabet. Well, Alphabet is a new holding company that is now restructuring pieces of Google. My group, Google Access, you probably know it more from Google Fiber, gigabit service. But it's the same company. My kids just don't think it's as cool sounding. So, I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing in the 3.5 band. Not a lot of public safety activity in there right now, but this is important to you for two ways. First of all, it's an incredible opportunity for infrastructure and public safety and existing Part 90 operators. And secondly, you ought to think of this as the shape of things to come. You were very lucky to get Band 14 because of some weird dynamics and auctions, but there's not a lot of low-hanging fruit. So if you believe your bandwidth's going up and you don't have the resources now, it's very likely you're going to have to turn to sharing spectrum. So I'm going to talk about the regime in one particular band, the first band where DoD actually offered up the opportunity to share it. But I think this sets the stage for how we'll think about future bands. So maybe you'll want to jump into this and join us Thursday in another session we're having and start doing this, or maybe it'll be another band that comes up perhaps at 5 gig, 28 gig, but you're going to have to deal with spectrum sharing sometime probably fairly early in your career. So, this is my job jar at Google Alphabet. Obtain regulatory approval. Everything begins with regulators. Develop an industry standards for interoperability and coexistence and a scalable architecture. Certainly, this community understands the importance of having open and interoperable systems because it's a big obstacle if you don't do it at the onset. 3, having done that, we needed to recruit people from industry to come and actually build the equipment. And then lastly, we need to have people buy it and deploy it and make use of this band and prove this whole framework was worth the trouble. Last year I was at IWCE and we kind of did a progress. We were somewhere in the middle of developing the structure for the interoperability and the scalable network. It's going along well, but certainly we were at the point we could say, hey, we're ready for prime time. So today, here, is where we're at. We have now got a large number of suppliers who are working to actually implement these protocols. On Thursday, we're going to have kind of an industry show. If you want to come, then we'll tell you what we actually have. And now we're in the stage where we're really looking to reach out to the different communities that want to run networks to embrace this technology and make use of it. So this is a sales pitch, as well as educational. So let's think about wireless. The spectrum's all one big unified thing. But because of the technology and regulation, we have broken each of the communities into their own little stovepipes. Enterprise use Wi-Fi. Military has its own unique high-cost systems. Public safety, most people in the room, you know what you have. Carriers exist in exclusively licensed spectrum. Not only is the spectrum different, but the technologies in each are separate, divorced, standalone, and have no ability to support each other. With spectrum sharing, not only do we share with primaries and secondaries and all that rights issues, but we create sharing amongst groups. So what we're going to show you is that spectrum sharing, not only does it create sharing primary, secondary, the way we've always thought it, but sharing among groups of users creates the economy of scale. It creates new markets for equipment, and it creates new opportunities for you to invest and buy technologies that would otherwise be inaccessible. And the poster child for that, as we talk, is going to be the ability for building private LTE networks. Now, you might notice that I did not include public safety in that little red box, and you should be very insulted. But there's good reasons for that, why public safety hasn't been part of the sharing. And we have a session, I think it's W04, where I'm going to talk about some of the reasons why. What does it take to bring public safety into that shared framework? And that's going to be your task. But I'll tell you what the shared framework is, and you can take it as homework. So, when PCAST, as the President's Council of Advisors of Science and Technology, report came out, the big news that was covered everywhere was government agrees to share spectrum. And that was really cool. That was awesome. There's a lot of other things in that report that are really important to the wireless community. It proposed that we move away from human management to cloud-based management. It proposed that we should manage transactions and interactions with the regulators through a number of microtransactions. Eric Schmidt shared this. Not surprisingly, you can kind of see the idea of AdWords kind of embedded in this. We'd have little micro auctions rather than one big multi-billion-dollar auction, very small auction, small space and time that would allow a much wider range of participation. Multi-tier spectrum, not just exclusive use by one owner, but a tiered right set so that we ensure all spectrum gets used. And then totally automatic entrance into the band and interference analysis. We all do it by computer. I mean, if you've been involved in this, it's kind of ridiculous. We do all this analysis on a computer, we give it to a bunch of lawyers, they turn it into a document, and we file paper with the FCC. So if we're doing it on the computer and we're going to run these systems by computer, why don't we just tie that whole chain together? And that's what PCAST proposed and what the FCC has largely moved ahead to adopt. So, I want to step back a bit. Most of us in this room are radio guys. You know, we think of spectrum as a tool we use for radios, and the value of spectrum is what it can do for our radios. I want you to think of it differently. Spectrum drives or precludes innovation. Our economy is strong because we have companies like mine, Microsoft, our competitors, who are incredibly innovative because they can build products scalably. They can reach out, they can try something in one city like we did Google Fiber in Kansas City, and then they can expand it. So you've got to be able to have those attributes. Spectrum precludes that ecosystem. If you spend $10 billion for an asset, you're not going to experiment. If you get one chance every 5 to 8 years to buy an asset, you can't think about scaling a business up. So you should be thinking about spectrum now. Not just does the spectrum policy work well for radios, but does it enable the ecosystem we're looking for? And so at PCAST, we kind of had this idea of venture-friendly. What does it take to make spectrum policy friendly to the kind of venture ecosystem that has created so much of the wealth in America today? And when we talk about the report, the interesting thing was within the Obama administration, our advocate was from the Council of Economic Advisors, Furman, who was advocating because he saw that new spectrum policies that were innovative and open to a much wider community would create innovation in America. So we're going to talk a lot about radios and dB and modulations and all that, and those are all important. But we should think about spectrum as something that allows that next cool garage thing. So think about our internet experience. You know, my company started with one little server. It didn't have to fill a room full of dial-up modems. It didn't have to go buy a big data center. It could just fire up, it could connect to the internet, and all of a sudden people could use the product, it could buy more and more computers, and it could scale up. You can't imagine that cycle if it was spectrum dependent. Similarly, now if you've got a new startup idea and you want to go do it, you don't have to go build a data center. You don't have to go buy a room full of telephones. You connect to the internet, you buy it on the cloud. If you are building an internet-based system, you have incredible scalability. You can try it out, you can experiment, you can learn. You can kill it, fail fast. None of that exists spectrum. So when you look at what I'm going to talk about, one reaction is, as a radio guy, what does it mean for my radio? But you ought to think, if you were an entrepreneur or your kid was an entrepreneur, how would this enable them to build a business and do some exciting stuff in RF? Because let's face it, RF's getting kind of stodgy. So, next. Yeah, these are some of the precepts from the report. It's not written in this way, but when I went through it a year and a half later, I tried to really understand the key ideas. We need to have multiple tiers of spectrum. There are different rights models. Today, every piece of spectrum has a single rights model. Who knows what the right model is? I don't. Best way to do is put it in the market, let the marketplace decide. We want to have a protected tier. A lot of people think shared spectrum, well, it'll all be like Wi-Fi. There are good reasons why people need protection, so we ought to have protection. We ought to change the licensing model. Today, when you license spectrum, you get really two rights. You get a right, what you really want, to be protected, and you get a right to exclude anyone else, because that's the only way we in the past have figured out to protect you. And PCAST, take away that right to exclude. You get protection, but you can't exclude someone else. There's a whole lot of spectrum laying fallow out there because someone licensed it and isn't using it. Someone can use it without interfering with them. So in this model, yes, if you deploy, you get protection, but if you don't deploy, other people can use the band. The Wi-Fi experience was very successful. So we should have an open area where people can just come and accept interference, and that's a lower tier. And so these basic precepts kind of laid out a different approach to spectrum. So, protected tier. A lot of people in the shared spectrum community walked away from PCAST because they said, it's horrible, it's carrier friendly because it's got a protected tier. There are a lot of applications that require protection. And it's wrong for regulators to judge no one should get it, or frankly, everyone should get it. So you have a protected tier. It competes with an unprotected tier. If you have technology that is not interference tolerant, if you're going to invest a large amount of money, then it's reasonable that you can buy protection for those assets. So we thought it was important to have this as an option. Similarly, we wanted an unprotected tier. The unprotected tier is incredibly disruptive, disruptive being a good thing. What it means is that now, instead of having a rights model, say if you're building an LTE tower and you're one of the carriers, different than when you're building Wi-Fi, we have one rights model for both, protected and unprotected. You can buy equipment, deploy it unprotected. If you get interference, you can buy protection for it. If the cost of spectrum gets so onerous, as we have seen it in past auctions, you can say, look, I'll live with 10% interference. The box cost me $400. Why would I pay $1,000 to protect it? I'll live with 10% loss. We make spectrum buying become an economic decision. It's not existential to your service. If it's advantageous to you, buy it. If it's not advantageous, don't. If the price goes up, just drop the protection and revert to unprotected. You never get forced out of the band. If you deploy a service with a multi-tier, you will never be forced out because you don't win an auction. And you won't be precluded because you didn't bid in on day one because those auctions are recurrent. So this lower tier acts as a cap for the price of spectrum. Spectrum should never cost more than its value and interference reduction to the box owner. And that hopefully holds it down. So, one other thing. Not so much in this kind of conference, but if you go to a lot of conferences, there will be thousands of papers that are written about the optimal way to manage spectrum, the optimal waveform, the optimal technology, and tell regulators how they should make the optimal decision. So one of the other principles, less formal, as my boss calls it, is no poobahs. No one gets to make decisions about what's right and optimal. So PCAST framework is strongly based on competition. We have Google will be one of the spectrum access, or Alphabet will be one of the spectrum access service providers called SaaS. But the whole framework should have multiple of those. Not a government one, because if the government built it, we'd probably get the same people who built healthcare.com. Not a single company anointed to do it, because they become stagnant. No matter who you are, if you're not competed with, you become stagnant. But to create a rich ecosystem where SaaS operators like myself compete. Below that, let's think about within the model. We have 2 tiers, and they compete. If unlicensed type operation works well for you, never buy spectrum, that tier fills up. If people really find they need protection, then that tier works. So we create really 2 spectrum models, and we let them compete, instead of going to the FCC and telling them, all arguing to set up one model. Users can specify what they want for protection. That competes. If you develop a better technology and you don't need so much protection, you get an incentive because you don't have to buy as much protection for it. Today, people have an incentive to build lousy radios. Because you build lousy radios, anyone wants to do something, you claim, oh, they'll interfere with me. You get more rights because your radio is poor. We reverse that. You will save money if you build better equipment. We want to incentivize people not to beat the barest, the regulatory standards, but to actually reach out and try to make the equipment better and reward them for doing that. And I know TJ is going to get up and talk about the incentive structure within the FirstNet, but equally here, we need to bring incentives into an area which has largely relied on arguments to regulators. And so this framework starts to do that. So, a little history on the PCAST proposal. Came out, I thought it was a brilliant piece of work, but I had some editorial pride. Came out to pretty much universal rejection. CTIA, the carriers, the equipment providers, all pretty much argued it wouldn't work. No one would invest and all. The House held hearings, maybe to block it, and allowed only one witness on our side. But in the end, the FCC did move ahead with it. President Obama signed an executive memorandum. And lo and behold, today, pretty much everybody who criticized it is part of both the Wireless Innovation Forum and the CBRS Alliance. The community has come together and really decided that this offers something that wasn't possible before. And so all of that opposition is pretty much gone. And today I can talk to you about a fairly unified approach of the current mobile operators, mobile system operators, and private venues, all working together to create an ecosystem. It's been a complete 180. So, spectrum policy is an enabler. I want to come back on this. Think about how this policy now, as the FCC moves forward. We create these new opportunities for people now to enter into something. So you can think about scalability. I want you to think, how do I scale? Think about, I'm a venture capitalist, or you're coming to me as a VC, and you're going to tell me, well, I want to do a new business. And I'm going to ask you I need about $30 million to build a product and pilot it, but I need $10 billion to go buy some spectrum. And it will take me 8 years to move into that spectrum, which is the average after an auction. And furthermore, if my idea works, I maybe will never have a chance to buy any more spectrum, so we can never expand the business. And now think about it now in this model, where you can come into a city, not even have to buy anything, try it out in this unlicensed tier. If it's really successful, it gets lots of business. You can buy some small auction blocks. As you want to move to another city, you can go into that city unlicensed. When an auction comes available, buy some spectrum. You can grow the thing the way you grow something else. So this is really thinking about spectrum policy now driving innovation as compared to the reverse, where we've tended to have people try to innovate around policies that were built to support very static business models. Sorry, a little slow. The clicker here is about 2 seconds behind me. So first step, FCC did the Citizens Broadband radio service. There are those who think there's sort of a CB Channel 19 joke embedded in that. It largely adopted the PCAST principles. It is 3 tiers. It is managed by a SaaS, as proposed by PCAST. They didn't pick up everything that we proposed. They didn't like the idea of dynamic harm claim thresholds. But by and large, they picked it up. The FCC created a unique FCC part for this, Part 96. This, I think, evidences an intent to put more and more bands under this regime. And therefore, whether you're interested in 3.5 gig or you are interested in some of the other frequencies, this is a framework that probably will be the starting point for a lot of bands in the US, and we're now seeing interest in worldwide. Unique part, there's been 2 reports and orders that made this happen. The SAS process is often going to get approval, and this train's moving. So 3 tiers, real quick. Top tier is US naval aircraft carriers. Good news is they cost something like $12 billion. Therefore, there are not a lot of them. We have about 27 Navy radars in the band. We have some, there's some satellite dishes that are using European allocations, but a relatively small number of primary users. We have a PAL license in the 2nd tier. This is what you can buy at auction. Currently, they're defined to be a census tract. That's about 4,000 people, large area. So if you want to do a venue, a shopping mall, it's practical to go and buy protection just within that venue. And then the 3rd tier is general authorized access. It's not unlicensed like we think Wi-Fi. Authorized access means that it can be removed. If you've followed Wi-Fi and DFS, there were a lot of problems with DFS's rollout. It was hard to chase down. Part of the deal with the incumbents is that we would be able to shut devices down. We would have positive control over them, and that's this general access tier. But to most devices, it will feel kind of like Wi-Fi. So why is 3 tiers important? And I think I've covered a lot of this, but 3 tiers creates this ability to move among. The first tier is kind of lost to us, but we have the same technology in both tiers. So today, if you're building a network in your house, you are pretty much limited to Wi-Fi. And if you're a carrier, you're doing macro and exclusive, you generally prefer to deploy LTE. Now, whichever tier you're in, you can use the same technology. The military could buy this LTE gear that is now native in their band. You in a home could build an LTE network and have all the benefits of security and manageability and scalability and interference control of LTE. You could put Wi-Fi, you could put whatever you want. If you're a carrier, you may well be able to buy stuff now at the consumer price point that we see in Wi-Fi if they get benefits from the volume. So by creating a sort of a common market for equipment and technology that isn't arbitrarily partitioned by regulation, we give everyone a choice of technologies, because those technologies now can compete, and we give everyone the benefit of a much higher volume. So we are now seeing companies that we'll talk about on Thursday thinking about LTE base stations, if you will, fully capable LTE base stations, 3GPP compliant, that are maybe twice the price of a Wi-Fi access point. Very, very low compared to what that traditionally costs. So it creates this ability to scale up that we otherwise don't get. So practical implications. Okay, so by now I've convinced you this is really cool, I want in. So what do you get? Well, you get access to 150 megahertz of spectrum. Some of it may be PAL, and there may be a PAL deployed there, in which case you can't use it. If someone just bought it and warehoused it like so many people do with Spectrum, you can keep using it until they actually deploy. In a large venue, if you're distant from PAL and you don't allow one to deploy, you probably have all 150 megahertz. If you have a lot of clutter loss between you and a PAL, you'll have all 150 megahertz, or if no one bought it. We're looking at doing sports venues. Most of them are out in the middle of nowhere. They'll probably have 150 megahertz. And what you have is an industry working together to where you are in dense areas to establish coexistence. So we're going to have 2 layers of coexistence. We're going to have coexistence between technologies, perhaps WiMAX and LTE, and we'll worry about that in WinnForum. And then the CBRS Alliance is focused on TD-LTE. If you buy LTE gear, LTE has an incredible number of features for an operator to manage interference amongst its network. We want to extend those to operate across networks. So if I'm an enterprise and I'm separated on the same floor from another enterprise, that we can use the features of LTE to do a time alignment and to manage it so that both of us can use 150 megahertz without hurting ourselves. Really unique. So practically, you're going to get a lot of benefits out of this, out of the technology. So how does it work? You buy the device, you take the device home, simplest case, you plug it in the wall. It calls up, does all of its normal thing, and it calls up a SAS, and it asks for a grant. The grant just tells it, well, here I am, this is where I'm going, if I've got an antenna where I'm pointing. The SAS makes sure it's legal in the FCC rules, your power and all is set. It will come up, it will find a piece of spectrum that has the best coexistence for you and whatever license you have, and it will give you a grant. It will then tell all the other SASs about the grant it gave you so that anyone else who makes other grants in that area is aware of you and manages coexistence well, and if you have protection, make sure you're protected. So whatever SAS you work, all these SAS operators will collaborate together. That was one of our heaviest lifts. People don't like sharing their network data, but I think we've solved that. We still have to do a little bit of work. We know about all these protected assets. For 5 years after the RNO, Part 90 operators get protection. The dishes that do telemetry, all those are in our database. We handle all that for you. You don't have to worry about it. We sense for the Navy, and there's these 27 radars. They're a gigawatt pulse, so they're not hard to hear. And we sense if we hear one of those, we'll move people off that channel in the broad area where that naval ship is operating its radar in. It's only a 2 megahertz wide radar, so we have 15 channels. So it really won't interrupt much. We just give you a new frequency. But I think the most important thing is that all of what I just talked about is completely hidden from you. It's kind of like using, a cloud-based mail service. You don't have to know about all the details. You just go and the stuff comes up in your mail. I think of it as like a spectrum DHCP. DHCPs do some complex stuff in the NAT, but you don't have to know about it. You just plug your box in and anyone can take a box home and make it work. So this is kind of our spectrum DHCP. If you currently are managing networks and you have a little book and you write down all the channels you assign to people, you can throw the book away. Just like 10 years ago, we threw that book of IP addresses away. So, use cases. So what's useful here? When we started this, I think everyone came in the assumption carriers would all go to PAL, everyone else would go to unlicensed. People are becoming more sophisticated. The carriers now see that not paying for spectrum is a really good thing. They have technologies like LAA that let them mix spectrum. So I think we'll see carriers in GAA. And we're also seeing enterprises that are interested when they have large areas to buy PALs, particularly MSOs. So it's becoming mixed. Everyone's starting to understand that they can really build subtle mixes of spectrum to manage very critical traffic on one net and then manage bulk traffic on another. I think you're going to see a lot of very sophisticated products come out by vendors. We've left this mix to vendors to optimize. So again, we want to always have incentives and competition. So it's up to the vendors of this equipment to come and tell you how clever they are in mixing and matching protected and unprotected spectrum. And that's exactly the incentives we want to keep. There'll also be another community moving into this band. The Part 90 operators are required by the FCC to move. They've got about 3 years left, so that might be the first use case here. And I want to talk a little bit now about the mobile case. Our image of mobile still is a legacy of when mobile's bandwidth was scarce and where coverage was poor. Most of us remember when we got a mobile plan that we opened up the little trifold and you took a look at the map and you looked at your house and your office and the commute path to make sure you were covered. We still think of coverage as important. People talk about beachfront spectrum. Well, I don't think there is beachfront spectrum anymore. And coverage, if you watch the advertisements, is in one ad almost ridiculed as a criteria for purchase. People care about capacity more, not outdoors. We have Google Maps, maybe that's the killer app outdoors. But the bulk of the growth, the growth in virtual reality, in 360, all these new tools and 4K video, it's all indoors. Indoors is really poorly suited to the architecture we have for wireless today. that carrier blasting from outside is losing 30 dB, at least coming through these walls. It's pretty tough if you deliver 1,000 units of product and only one actually gets to the customer. That's what they're trying to do. So one should think about this band also in light of this fundamental change in what wireless means. It is increasingly an indoor capacity driven, not outdoor coverage driven. And this band is wonderful for it. A couple of years ago, you would say, we said beachfront goes through everything, it's really good. Now it goes through everything means interferes everywhere. Having absorption is a good thing. Having path loss is a good thing because it lets me dense up my network. So at 3.5 gig, 8 inches of concrete has 51 dB of loss. That means you can put a access point both sides of a wall and they operate with full spectrum. So this is a really unique opportunity to create the multi-gigabit networks that people will increasingly rely on. We have our Google Fiber product. It's a gigabit. When it was rolled out by my boss, 6 years ago, people, what do you do with a gigabit? Are people actually filling that pipe up? You watch some 4K streams, on a couple tablets and all, you can start to really chew into a gigabit. So our demand indoors is going to become even more. And so you should think about this. How does this band help us look at business models that are more appropriate to the indoor case? So one of them proposes neutral host. I will say, certainly in disclosure say that carriers haven't bought into this yet. I kind of view their not buying in as like my not wanting to have a root canal. There are a lot of things you don't want, you have to do. But we'll see. So a lot of different interpretations of neutral host. Generally, it's a single network, standalone, private network that also offers services to carriers, where any carrier can roam on it. Now, in this band, one of the rules the FCC put in was if you support the band, you have to support the entire band. So if it's in mobile operator A's phone, then it can work, it has to work across the entire band. Therefore, if you deploy an access point, by definition, 3.5, by definition, that handset can contact it. Now, whether it authenticates at all is a business matter with the operator. But technically, we now have one band in common with all of the MNOs in the United States, all of the MNOs, accessible by a business, accessible by a shopping center, accessible by your house. So for the first time, we have a lingua franca, or everyone who builds networks and everyone who uses networks can be on the same band with the same rights. And that creates, I think, some really exciting new models. And as I said, neutral host is one of them. So now a business that might build out 3.5 LTE for internal use can sell that capacity back. I'm a hospital. I build 3.5 because I want to put paging and HIPAA and all those issues on it and use the security of LTE. When people visit the hospital, they can use it, and then I charge that back to a carrier. A lot of work going on to define what this really means. But, and this is in the CBRS Alliance where we're working this and the Multifire Alliance. But it's so obviously the right thing to do, it's hard to believe we won't end up there. Because look at the advantages it has for everybody. If you are the cost of deployment's lower. So if you are building this in part of a Wi-Fi deployment, you're adding perhaps $100 to the cost of an enterprise Wi-Fi, and you're getting 150 megahertz of spectrum, and you're getting the right to monetize it back. It's a lot cheaper for the enterprise to build it out with the rest of IT than for 4 individual carriers to come back, put their own deployment in, pull dark fiber, and do all that. From the carrier point of view, he's only paying for a very small part of an infrastructure that has many, many other partners sharing in the cost. So there should be a lot of room between what it costs a carrier to deploy a gigabit of capacity in an area and what it costs a venue to add a gigabit of capacity to its existing deployment. We have a lot of work to work this out, but I think it's an inevitable process. MVNOs and all, same thing. They can come in and buy that capacity. So we see this as one of the really interesting implications of this band. Maybe it's the first innovation that appears because of the band, and hopefully there'll be a number behind it. If you go to a commercial conference on wireless today, for CMRS, no one can hold a conference if they don't have 5G in the title. 5G is the big thing. 5G below 6 is basically similar to LTE. 5G above 6 gigahertz, very complex beamforming, very expensive systems, but really very high capacity. But let's think about them indoors. 28 gig doesn't go through walls. It's going to have to be built out indoors. We at least believe that the model we're evolving in 3.5 for neutral host, for cooperation between venues and operators to meet this bandwidth demand, is the logical model for 5G. And everyone's trying to fight for the intellectual property on the beamforming and the waveform, but maybe the most valuable property in 5G might be understanding how to deploy it economically, to come up with a business model that works between the venues where the people are and the operators who have to monetize it. So we have a belief that what we're looking at is very possibly a good use case for how 5G might emerge as it goes through this process of deploying. Because it has every one of the issues of 3.5 and every one of the propagation determinants. So none of this would happen if it wasn't collaborative. When we started this out, Google was pretty much the only company that was really excited about this opportunity. But if we went out and tried to create an ecosystem, it would have been just Google. It would be very hard for people to buy in. So we made a conscious decision that we had to create an ecosystem. We had to create competitors. Competitors with us on being SaaS operators and a variety of different hardware vendors. And that became the Wireless Innovation Forum. We've agreed on all the standards, all the interoperability for devices to make use of Part 96. So whoever you buy from in Part 96, they'll be able to operate with this SaaS and all. If you don't like your SaaS supplier, you can switch SaaS suppliers. We've done a lot of work. I think we've done a great job, frankly. We're meeting in the far back if you want to hike all the way to the end to come to our meetings. But we have a standard interoperability. We have some test suites out. Our company announced a trusted tester program. So this is off and going. And there will be a set of industry standard devices in this band. More recently, we formed CBRS Alliance. CBRS Alliance is specific to TD-LTE, and it is to both develop the standards for coexistence, for better harmony among TD-LTE, and frankly, to promote it as a solution in this band. So WinnForum is kind of technology neutral. It worries about meeting FCC compliance. CBRS Alliance is downward looking, worrying about the very specific technologies for TD-LTE. But both of them are going to create interoperable standards so this equipment ecosystem is truly fluid and competitive. So all cool stuff, but all speculative. So Qualcomm, Nokia, and ourselves decided we needed a use case that was really interesting. So we did an experiment, talked to NASCAR, and did an experiment with Richard Petty to try to create 360 virtual reality for NASCAR. And if you look at that little arrow, that's one of these new 360 cameras. And what we wanted to make it so is you watch the race on TV or you watch the race in the stands, you could actually sit in the car next to the driver and look around the car and experience the noise, the vibration if you have a subwoofer, and look around, look out the rear window to see the car coming up behind, watch him go past or watch you go past them, and experience very much what the driver experienced. And it seemed like a great use case, because here's something you just couldn't do today. So we worked with Richard Petty at Las Vegas Speedway up towards Nellis, had a couple cars running around the track. The important thing is the uplink wasn't like we went out and bought a $10,000 special purpose radio. It was this early version of Qualcomm's standard UE for band 48 in this band. So you're not having to go out and buy a whole bunch of boutique hardware to build private networks that have high capacity. It's going to be the same cell phones you buy at the Verizon store or the AT&T store when they have band 48 in them. So that little quarter-watt uplink did the entire 4K video. And this is Richard Petty watching the video in one of his cars. He doesn't drive race cars anymore. But if you're a NASCAR fan, that's the king, and actually experiencing it. If you like this, we're gonna do a little more of this a bit later in the show and show you those videos, and you can try on the headsets. But it's a great example of the kind of things you can do with a private network in this band, even without carrier support. So, we have, as I mentioned, we have a workshop on Thursday. So, there's a lot of more detail about this band that's not appropriate for a keynote. If you have an interest in pursuing it, come to our workshop. It is 10 a.m. in the morning. We're going to spend the morning and do sort of a tutorial on the band, give you some more details. And then in the afternoon is the vendors who are offering product in this band talking to you about what their product is and what their plans are and how they envision rolling out the band. If you're operating under Part 90, in 3 years you have to be moving to this equipment anyway. If you're not compelled to, then this is a really cool opportunity to do things we could never do before in wireless, and to truly innovate and to make use of all of the technologies that are available to you. So we're a little bit focused towards the enterprise and WISPs because user equipment pipeline is a long, slow process, but these are the two early opportunities to get out there in the band. Oh, I will put one plug in. If you're really interested in the details of all this, I have a book coming out in the end of July that really walks through the whole three-tier spectrum process. It's some more detail about the policy issues and a lot about the individual technologies to make it work. I didn't think it was any one place people could go. And it's a great way to work for $6 an hour writing technical books. So it'll be out in July. And with that, I think I have a couple minutes for questions. I can take a couple questions. Bill? Okay, well I'll give you back to 2 minutes. Thank you very much.